Chapter 32. Abdu was driving Tayo to the airport, and Tayo was sitting in the back seat, wondering if he'd forgotten anything. He'd informed all the necessary people at the university and told his neighbours and editors of his departure. He'd also remembered to lock the home phone as well as all of the windows. There was really nothing of value in the house, just the house itself. But these days, thieves took anything, so everything had to be locked, double-locked, even triple-locked. He'd met with the gardener and night watchman and given them their instructions. They were to guard the property until he got back. This time, however, he hadn't told them when he would return. He suspected that the last time he went away, they'd used his garage to house relatives from Gindiri and Kafanchan and sold produce from his garden, maize, oranges, tomatoes, and bananas, even though he'd specifically instructed them not to. He had also asked Yusuf to check on the house from time to time. Yes, things in Nigeria were tough, but this did not give workers the right to take liberties with his property. Usually he travelled for a few weeks, enough time to attend several academic conferences and present a paper or two. But this trip would be different. He was going to Europe for the first time in 4 years, and it would keep him out of Nigeria for at least 6 months, which was the length of the visiting professorship in London. After that, he was not sure what he would do. A lot depended on what happened in Nigeria and to the university, but for now the University of Jos remained closed, and no one knew when it would reopen. "You de craze!" Abdu shouted suddenly, hitting his palm against the horn. "Foolish man," Tayo said, seeing the petrol tanker overtake within yards of oncoming traffic. Tayo shook his head angrily as the memory of his mother's accident flashed through his mind. It was pure luck whether or not you survived an accident caused by these lawless drivers. "Professor, if you can find me a job in England, I will be so happy." Abdu broke into Tayo's thoughts. "I will see what I can do," Tayo promised. "But you know, in England, if you don't have working papers, they won't employ you these days. When I was a student, we didn't need visas and that sort of thing, but everything has changed now. It's not like the old days." "Yes, sir," Abdu said. "But by God's grace I must go. Maybe I can find an English wife, so as not to be troubled by the authorities." "Maybe," Tayo replied, "but make sure you love her and not just the papers. Marriage is a very serious thing, young man," he added, wincing at the sound of his own words. A very serious thing was just the sort of utterance that a man his age was supposed to make, especially given that his marriage had not survived. "Listen to me, because I have failed. I should know." It was so easy to declare marriage a serious thing, but it was also such a cliché, and what use had it served him? He had ended the relationship with Vanessa because he had lost his nerve, and then sensibly married Miriam because, from all indications, it was the right thing to do. Had he followed his heart and not his head, he would have chosen differently. But perhaps it had nothing to do with head versus heart. Perhaps it had everything to do with him and his inability to understand women and relate to them as he should. In a few hours he would be seeing his old girlfriend, a married woman whom he still loved, a woman married to his old benefactor. Marriage is a very serious thing, so what was he doing thinking constantly of the age difference between Edward and Vanessa? How wrong it was for him to be thinking of how soon Edward might die, leaving Vanessa free to be with him. He wasn't proud of this train of thought, but it didn't stop him thinking such thoughts. It also hadn't prevented him from expressing affection in his letters to Vanessa. Of course, he did it in such a way that could be interpreted by a third person as simply an expression of deep friendship. Her letters were the same. It seemed to him that they both understood what the other was doing, each discreetly expressing their love. But what if he were mistaken? Perhaps this was simply what he wanted to think. Vanessa had never said she was unhappy with Edward, and even if she had, what were they to do? How wrong it would be to come between two people in a marriage. No, he would never do that. Life must go on. He had brought Vanessa's diary with him, and would return it. Whatever he might feel, he must behave responsibly and keep his desire in check. And so he tried to think of other things. He pictured their home, with Edward's history books stacked high on the shelves as they were in Oxford, and he pictured their art. There would be plenty of African art now, the combined collection of two art lovers. Lovers, the word echoed uncomfortably in Tayo's head as he recalled Edward's advice on marriage. Tayo looked at himself in the rear-view mirror and realized that he hadn't imagined how he might appear to Vanessa. In 4 years, he had aged. Gaunt and balding now, not young and muscular like his younger self. He looked away. Outside, storm clouds had gathered, and the sky had turned from pale blue to a threatening charcoal grey. Birds took flight, and a lone monkey dashed across the road, running for cover. Tayo thought that the lorry behind them must also be trying to outrun the storm. Abdu must have presumed the same as he pulled to one side to let it pass. But it didn't overtake. "What's wrong with these people?" Tayo shouted, gesturing at the driver to keep his distance. Abdu pulled over further to give the driver more room, but still the driver did not overtake. It was then that Tayo saw the military uniforms and knew. "Abdu!" he screamed. Part 4. Summer, 1998. Chapter 33. Tayo was staying with Kemi in her one-bedroom apartment on Franklin Street. It was one of the few streets in San Francisco that never went to sleep. At all hours of night and day, cars accelerated down the hill, filling the air with exhaust fumes that rose to the level of her second-floor apartment. The noise of engines, brakes, and the occasional blaring of horns meant that the night was never silent, nor was it dark. There was always a steady stream of headlights, and sometimes the whirling lights of emergency vehicles, their sirens piercing the night with their high-pitched wails. Sleep was hard, but then it always was these days. If Tayo did fall asleep, he dreamt of Nigeria and woke sweating. He had 2 recurring nightmares, one in which he was drowning in a prison cell, and the other where Abdu floated away in the form of a sheet of paper that Tayo could never catch. People said that after the accident, Abdu appeared fine. When they pulled him from the wreck, he was able to walk and insisted on helping to carry Tayo. The nurses had bandaged Abdu's facial lacerations, but it was the bleeding inside, the bleeding nobody saw, that later caused Abdu to collapse and die. They said that little could have been done, even had they caught the internal bleeding, but Tayo was not convinced. He knew that he had received more medical attention that day than Abdu. Now Abdu was dead, and there was nothing Tayo could do to bring him back. Tayo was now in America, far from Nigeria, unable to comfort Abdu's family, and not even able to support his own family. The plan had been for Tayo to stay with Kemi in San Francisco for a month, enough time to be seen by the medical specialists and wait for his leg to recover. While abroad, he would contact universities and inquire about jobs. Kemi had organized his trip to the US, flying him via France. He regretted not being able to fly through London to see Vanessa, even though he knew that not only was it a miracle that he'd survived the accident, but also that he'd been able to get out of the country. Kemi had insisted that her father use her bedroom while she slept in a room created out of a storage cupboard. Tayo wanted to be the one to use the makeshift room, but she wouldn't let him. She never said anything to suggest that he was being a burden, but he still felt like his stay was a great encumbrance. What father, he repeatedly asked himself, should be relying on a daughter in this way? And then, when he found out that Kemi was working as a nanny to fund her artistic endeavors, he felt even worse. How could his daughter be doing such a menial job while he lived with her, in her flat, doing nothing? Tayo's days dragged by, with the television as his only companion. He watched the news on CNN and CNBC, morning, afternoon, and evening. He watched in the hope of catching some international news, but almost always the coverage was domestic, of child abuse, murders, and serial killings, with just one lone global minute to cover the rest of the world. Sometimes he thought he should listen to music rather than watch TV, but he couldn't muster much interest in music these days. And yet there was plenty of music in the apartment. Kemi owned CDs by African musicians, many of whom he'd never heard of, groups like Les Nubians and Positive Black Soul. He guessed that this was the music she used to teach her students African dance, and found it curious that his daughter, living abroad, probably knew more about African music than many Africans in Africa. Kemi also owned some of Miriam's favorites, Sunny Ade and Miriam Makeba, and whenever Kemi played these it brought back memories for Tayo, some happy, but mostly sad. He wondered what Kemi told Miriam about him these days. Sometimes, when mother and daughter spoke on the phone, he would say a few words to Miriam. He would ask her how she was, and she did the same, short and perfunctory, speaking more for Kemi's sake than for theirs. Kemi left early every morning for work and returned around 6 in the evening. She would then leave again to buy cheap food on Polk or Union Street, or they would have food delivered to the apartment in paper boxes and styrofoam cups. Tayo worried that his daughter wasted money on such food. He also feared that Kemi wouldn't find the right husband without culinary skills. It wasn't that Kemi didn't know how to cook. She just didn't like it, and the fridge was always empty. On the outside, though, the fridge was crowded with magnetic letters, photographs of Kemi's friends, and an assortment of poems and sayings. Her boyfriend, Laurent, could cook, but that was his job. Tayo presumed Kemi saw him during her lunch breaks, and perhaps on the occasional evening when she came home late. He never asked. Laurent was a nice enough man, but not, in his view, suitable for his daughter. The fact that he was a chef was bad enough, but he also didn't have a degree. Tayo wondered if this was the price he now paid for encouraging Kemi to have a mind of her own. He was pleased, at least, that Laurent did not visit the apartment or stay overnight. "You should get out, Daddy," Kemi insisted as the days passed. He told her that he did, even though it was obvious that he rarely left the apartment. He wanted to return to Nigeria. Here, in Kemi's San Francisco, he didn't belong. One day, he'd gone to buy his daughter some tea. He'd been walking along Polk Street when he passed a shop selling international papers and spotted a story about Nigeria on the front page of Le Monde. He didn't buy the paper, he was careful with the dollars Kemi gave him, but he sat down on the bench outside and read what he could from the front cover on display. The news was not good. Falling oil prices and continued government corruption. No hope for Nigeria, he'd muttered, covering his head with both hands. The next thing he knew, someone was tapping his shoulder, and when he looked up, a middle-aged woman was handing him a bagel. At first he was puzzled, then shocked. It was not even a whole bagel that she gave him, but part of one, half eaten. "You need to see a therapist," Kemi insisted. "You're suffering from depression." "I'm perfectly fine," he replied. What right did she have to say such things? Besides, he did not believe in therapists, and nor should she. Therapy was a Western thing, a fad, and a waste of money. If he didn't want to go out, why should he? His leg had not healed, his country was in chaos, and he was trapped in America. Yet still, Kemi persisted. "You're depressed," she said, "and you need to do something about it. You should contact the universities, plan for your future." "Don't tell me what to do, Kemi. I'm not going to stay here any longer than I have to if that's what you're concerned about." "I'm not concerned about that. I'm worried about you." "Well, it's not your responsibility to worry about me. You've already taken care of the medical expenses." "You could see my therapist." "I should do what?" "You could see my therapist," Kemi repeated. "You have a therapist? For what?" "Oh, for goodness sakes, Daddy." "What do you need one for? Do you think it was easy to live without a father for so many years and then to watch you and Mum divorce?" "But it doesn't matter why I see a therapist. The fact is I do, and it helps me." "Well, I really don't understand." Tayo shook his head in despair. "And you wouldn't," she shouted, thrusting her hands into the air in a gesture that shocked him in its resemblance to something her mother would do. You hardly know me. You sent us off to England, never caring what happened to your wife or your daughter. All that mattered was your work. So is that what your mother tells you? Tayo asked, struggling to contain his anger. She didn't have to. I could see for myself. And this is how you speak to your father now with no respect? Respect? Is that all that matters? What about love? I've always wanted to be close to you, but all the time you just talk about respect, bloody respect. Well, no. If you must know, I don't respect you. I don't respect what you did to us. I don't respect how you left us, how you always thought about your work first. Now you come here and I try to help. I try to make suggestions. Even Laurent tries and... Listen, don't talk to me about Laurent. Why? Because he's white? No, because in our culture, whose culture? The one that you made up? In our culture, Kemi, you listen to your father. Don't you dare shout at me! Tayo glanced at his daughter, shocked. Never before had he seen his daughter behave so disrespectfully. You always wanted me to marry an African, didn't you? She persisted. Nothing is good enough for you, is it? I teach African dance, I search for my roots, I try to help you by making suggestions, but nothing is good enough, nothing. Tayo said nothing as she stormed out of the room. Let her be, he thought. But he couldn't let her go and cry on her own. A few moments later he was tapping gently on the bathroom door, behind which he could hear her crying. Kemi, please, he said, let's not talk this way. He tapped again, but still no answer. He left for a while, pacing up and down, listening to her sobs and wondering what to do next. Then she left the apartment, slamming the door behind her. Not knowing what else to do, he went to the bathroom where she'd been. The smells of Kemi reminded him of Miriam, the soaps, shampoos, and perfumes of these two women, the women he had wronged. Why was he so incapable, so inept? What was wrong with him? Why couldn't he love another person the way one was supposed to? Mama, Miriam, Christine, Vanessa, Kemi, and even Hawa had despised him. It would be better that he went away and left everyone in peace. Later that evening, when Kemi finally returned and he saw that she was fine, he told her that he was taking a walk. The fog had rolled in and the air hung damp and cold. He didn't bother with a coat. He walked as fast as he could, ignoring the pain in his leg, past Fort Mason, past the marina, and up to the Golden Gate Bridge. How easy it would be to jump. Just jump. While he calculated the odds of certain death, the height, the fact that he had never learnt to swim. A car whizzed past, playing Michael Jackson's music. Tayo turned and saw a little girl waving from the open window. He thought of Kemi and turned from the water. Kemi was on the phone when Tayo got back. I have no idea where the hell he is, she was saying. Tayo pushed quietly on the door handle to let himself out again, but then he paused with his hand still on the door, listening. I don't want to call the police, Laurent. I know he's just off somewhere sulking. He doesn't care. He won't even speak to his friends, and he doesn't know that Mum's the one sending all this money to pay for his medical bills. He doesn't give a shit. Miriam? Sending money? Tayo stepped back into the apartment, shutting the door noisily. After Kemi had hung up, he asked who she'd been on the phone with. She didn't want to talk about it, but later that night, Tayo found a way to start a conversation. You know, Kemi, when I was young, we didn't talk about our girlfriends or boyfriends to our parents, he began. And I forget sometimes that you were not always raised in Nigeria as I was. But I don't disapprove, and you must understand that I have nothing against white people. Nothing at all. Thinking about race is the American way, not ours. So you wouldn't mind if I married someone white? To be honest, I'd be more concerned if you married a Nigerian. There's so many crooks about these days. And besides, you're not the first person to fall in love with a white person, you know. You did? Kemi looked up curious. It was before you were born, Kemi, Tayo shrugged, regretting having brought it up. Vanessa was someone I met at Oxford. Did you think of marrying her? I suppose we did, but then I met your mum and... And then, well, that's all. You don't have to worry about what I'll think, Daddy, Kemi said. This is Vanessa Richardson, isn't it? Yes, as a matter of fact it is. Was, Tayo added, trying not to show his surprise. It wasn't hard to guess, Daddy, Kemi smiled. You've mentioned her several times since you've been here. Have I? I really didn't think, well, she's married now, so... Kemi looked at him, waiting for him to say more. He met her gaze, and when he said nothing more, she nodded with grown-up understanding. Sometimes I wonder how Laurent's parents really feel, Kemi mused. You've met them already? Tayo asked. Yes, they lived for a while in Liberia, you know. Laurent's father worked with Médecins Sans Frontières. His father's very nice, but it's his mother, well, maybe all mothers are protective of their sons. Do you think that's so, Daddy? Tayo shrugged, as if to say he didn't know, but he did. Mama had been that way. I'd like Laurent's mother to accept me. And she should, my love, she should, Tayo said, squeezing Kemi's hand. What parent wouldn't be delighted to have you as a daughter-in-law? He sighed, and resting his head on Kemi's shoulders, he shut his eyes. I hope you know that I didn't mean any of those nasty things I said this afternoon, Kemi whispered, placing a hand on his lap. I love you, Daddy, very much. I even respect you, she smiled. He squeezed her young hand, fighting back the tears. These were his first tears since his arrest. His daughter knew nothing about his arrest, and hopefully never would. Chapter 34. The kitchen table had become Vanessa's favourite place to write. The house was silent except for the ticking of an old clock. 3 a.m. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Vanessa rocked her head from side to side, in time with the sound as she stood up to make herself some tea. Yes, she thought to herself, this was what happened to mothers later in life. They became nocturnal creatures. She would always go to bed early with Edward, but then get up at these quiet moments of the night, the perfect time to think. Edward would sometimes join her, but only for a minute or two to remind her that she worked too hard and that she needed to sleep. She promised she wouldn't be long. He knew she'd stay up, and she knew he knew, but this was their script, and there was comfort in sticking to it. Now, as she waited for the water to boil, she thought of Tayo. It would still be daytime in California. What would he be doing? At least he was safe now. She sighed and returned to the table with her mug of rosehip tea. Everything was laid out, the manuscript, the photographs, and Saratu's letter. Shortly after father's death, Edward had suggested that she read her father's manuscript and consider publishing it. She'd been reluctant to do so at first, given how badly the relationship with her father had deteriorated over the years. For a long period, between mother's death and father going into care, Vanessa had hardly spoken to her father because of his refusal to accept Suleiman as his grandson. She thought many times of cutting him out of her life. Instead, she hid her father's nastiness from Suleiman and visited him in the home as little as possible. When father died, she wanted to get rid of all his papers, but Edward had encouraged her to read them first, which, after much procrastination, she did. She found, as she'd feared, a manuscript full of racist and patronizing comments about Africans, but the manuscript also contained many interesting details of the colonial period, and this presented something of a dilemma for Vanessa. While the racism was deplorable, she couldn't deny that the writings were of some historical significance. The manuscript included detailed notes on what was accomplished in the course of a district officer's day, and descriptions of journeys made on the Oriole. All that was missing was the perspective of the Nigerians who worked with her father. In the end, she had written to friends in Nigeria, hoping that some of father's former employees might still be around to give their stories. At first, nobody replied, but then she received the letter from Saratu. Dear Mrs. Barker, praise God that I obtained your letter dated 7th March 1997. I am now living in Gindiri, and so the letter took some time to reach me. I am happy to hear you are writing about Africa. God bless you. Mama would be very happy to know this. I'm sorry to inform you that Mama passed away on 5th August 1986. Until her death, she was talking of your mother, who was her favourite madame. She was still angry with the gardener for causing irresponsibility for your mother to leave our country when you were a child. I am hoping that you return to Nigeria again very soon. I would like to see you. God has blessed me with 6 children, 4 boys, 2 girls. Praise God. The eldest is named Elizabeth, the same as your mother. I'm sending you a picture of your mother that Mama used to keep. Also, I'm giving you one picture of myself. I am in the maternity ward at St. Teresa Hospital, where you can dispatch future correspondence. Mrs. Saratu Janu, care of Mother Teresa Hospital, P.O. Box 16, Gindiri, Nigeria. I wait to hear from you sooner rather than later. God bless you and your family. Vanessa smiled as she placed the letter back in a pile. She would have loved to see Saratu again. The photograph was a Polaroid, and the colours were faded, but the resemblance was clearly there. Saratu was looking like her mother now. She was round and short, with the same beautiful smile as her mother, and dressed in the pale blue nurse's uniform with a wide navy blue belt and silver buckle. Vanessa remembered the times when she and Saratu had played like sisters, climbing trees, running, jumping, or playing at being mothers. How different their lives had now become. Saratu was a competent mother of 6, and she, the somewhat failed mother of 1. She put the photograph down and touched the second photograph of mother. Then she picked up the picture of Danjuma and held them side by side. Danjuma's photograph was the one that mother had kept in a drawer, along with other pictures from Nigeria. Danjuma was posing in a smart shirt and formal trousers. He stood at an angle, looking across his shoulder at the camera. Why did you take this picture? Vanessa murmured. Did you send it to Mum? And what is this irresponsibility that Saratu speaks of? As a child, Vanessa had always believed that the reason she and mother returned to England before father was for her education. But last year, when she'd broached the topic with Uncle Tony, he told another story. Something had happened to upset mother in her second year in Nigeria, but nobody knew quite what. All Uncle Tony knew was that father travelled a lot, leaving mother behind, and he speculated that father had had an affair. So if father had had an affair, and mother was close to the gardener in a way that had always seemed to rile father, what if... Vanessa began to scribble what she knew as the facts on her notepad. June 46, mother and father marry. March 47, I'm born. June 47, our family set sail for Nigeria. Mother excited to go to Nigeria her first time. Mum's parents alarmed that she's leaving with young child but can't dissuade her. Mum strong-willed. She married man her parents disapproved of. 1948, difficult year. Mum and I get malaria. Father thinks it's a bad idea to keep his wife and daughter in Africa. Why? Mum wants to stay. She loves the sunshine, the outdoors, the locals. She makes friends at the market, at the clinic, with the house servants. Not what father expected. Embarrassed that wife befriends locals, especially house servants. 1949-1950, father tours Mambilla Plateau without mother and I, mother's closest friends, maid Rose, and gardener Danjuma. And then it struck Vanessa. What if Danjuma was the man that had told mother the sticks and sandals story? If so, might there have been some personal significance in him being the one to tell her? Were they lovers? Vanessa looked again at the 2 pictures. She wished she'd asked her mother more about life in Nigeria when she was alive, but she'd always felt too scared to. She was afraid of dredging up memories that would trigger mother's depression. But now she wondered if talking about Nigeria might have helped her mother. Father definitely held something against Danjuma, something personal. Vanessa began to put the pieces of stories together. She imagined. Danjuma, a young man, 19 or 20 years old, only a few years younger than Mother. Danjuma is strong and muscular and easygoing by nature. He laughs a lot and teaches Mother all that she wants to know about gardening. He offers to take her around the Jos Plateau, to show her the waterfalls and lush forests that she has not seen. And it is on these trips, perhaps, that something starts between them. His youthful spirit and good looks attract her. He finds her beautiful, and he likes the way she makes an effort to speak Hausa and to understand his culture and religion. Soon they are doing things in secret. For months they enjoy each other's company, until Father returns and their secret is discovered. Father refuses to believe that Mother loves a local servant. He wants Danjuma punished, flogged, and imprisoned. But perhaps this is when Mother tells Father that if he tries to do this, then she will reveal the truth. She will say that she loved Danjuma. And so they compromise. Mother returns to England with young Vanessa, and Father remains in Nigeria. Danjuma is sacked. Then what? Would Danjuma and Mother have corresponded in secret? She would like to find Danjuma to ask him his side of the story. Vanessa looked at the pictures again and thought of Tayo. "Mum?" Someone shook her shoulders. "Mum, why are you crying?" "I'm sorry," Vanessa sobbed. "Mum, you're shaking. What's wrong?" "It's Granddad's writing, isn't it?" Suleiman rested one hand on the table and the other on her shoulder. "Yes," Vanessa nodded, thankful for this excuse. "Can't you sleep, darling?" she asked, sliding her hand over his. She looked up at him and smiled. "I got up to read and I heard you crying," he squeezed her shoulder gently. "Look, Mum, don't let Granddad's stuff get to you. You know what I've been thinking?" He let go of her shoulder and walked to the fridge. "One day, I'll run a sort of literary agency for African writers." Vanessa watched Suleiman pour himself a drink. Her grown-up son, who was so kind these days. It made her happy to see him excited about ideas, and particularly about Africa, which was a passion they now shared. All they had talked about since his return were his business ideas and his desire to promote African art by setting up an art shop. She and Edward still wanted him to finish university, but Suleiman had inherited some of Salamatu's stubbornness, and his mind was set. "Well, if you're interested in books, you should speak to my friend Tayo," Vanessa said, watching the way her son was standing, drumming his fingers against the fridge. "You talk a lot about him," Suleiman returned with a glass of water. "You know, Mum, I've always wondered what it might be like to have a black father." "What do you mean?" "It was just something I used to think about, you know. I got so tired of everyone always being surprised that my parents were white, you and Dad, you know. So tell me, were you ever in love with Tayo? Was he in love with you?" "You'll have to ask him." "You're blushing, Mum." "No, I'm not." "You are now." "Oh, Suleiman," she reached across the table and tapped him playfully across the head. "I'm just teasing, Mum. I know you love Dad and all that, but you've always been so passionate about Africa that I reckon you still got some feelings for your African ex, yeah?" "That's what he was, wasn't he? An ex?" Suleiman winked as he left the room. "Oh, did you remember to wash my sweater?" he asked, popping back. "Suleiman." "Just checking, Mum, just checking." Chapter 35. A few weeks after her father arrived, Kemi had introduced Tayo to John Harris, professor of ethnic studies at San Francisco State University and grandfather to the children Kemi nannied. Professor Harris was delighted to meet Tayo and eager to get him to the university once he had convalesced. Very soon after, it seemed, Professor Harris was offering Tayo a part-time job in his department. Tayo was surprised and grateful for the offer, but at the same time he had little desire to interact with people, and a teaching job, he felt, would force him to do just that. Moreover, what would he teach? He would have politely declined had it not been for the fact that he knew Kemi needed the money. So Tayo started teaching, and, to his surprise, he enjoyed it. The students, the easy access to materials from the library, and the opportunity to work on his own writings. He taught 2 classes, one on the political history of West Africa, and a second on oral histories in northern Nigeria. A few weeks into the semester, as he was walking from the department to the library, someone tapped him on his shoulder. "Professor Ajayi, I do believe." "Yes?" Tayo turned, expecting to see a student. Tayo exclaimed. "What are you doing here?" "What are you doing here?" Kwame laughed as they embraced. Kwame had been teaching at the university for 7 years, and had only just heard of Tayo's arrival. The meeting felt like a homecoming to Tayo, and from that day on he had a friend with whom he talked about Nigeria, as well as his experiences in America. It was with Kwame that he would soon rekindle his love for jazz, occasionally going to Rosella's in the city, or to Yoshi's across the bay. Tayo's legs soon began to show signs of improvement, and then came the news that General Abacha had died, and this gave Tayo some hope. Tayo stopped minding when Kemi stayed out late at her boyfriend's, and even looked forward to Laurent coming to the apartment, as he did more often these days, to cook them a decent meal. Tayo bought himself a radio, listened to the BBC and NPR, and stopped watching television. He began to take buses to Grace Cathedral, and he listened to the boys' choir on Sundays. He bought music now, feeling better that he was earning some money, and as his legs steadily healed, he became more adventurous with his walks. He went to the water every day, sometimes more than once, for the exercise. His route was down Franklin Street to the wharf, across to Fort Mason, and onto the marina. As he walked, he liked to look at the houses and imagine who lived in them and where the people came from. Most of those on the stretch of Franklin Street between Lombard and Bay were split into apartments where young people lived. He would see them sometimes jogging or carrying their washing to a laundromat. Sometimes he would smell their food from open windows, eggs, bacon, and cinnamon. He presumed that most worked in the computer industry. He would see them in shops with their cell phones, beepers, and laptops. There were not many children in this part of town, but a few elderly people would venture out from time to time, accompanying or accompanied by their funny-looking dogs. He sometimes walked back along Bay through Fort Mason, where the houses looked quintessentially American, pretty little box-shaped homes with white picket fences. Military personnel owned these, or so he thought, but never knew for sure. Then there was the Safeway supermarket and the long stretch of stunning houses that stood behind the marina. Occasionally he would see fancy cars parked in the driveways and bright lights glowing in some of the rooms, where curtains were never closed. But many of these mansions looked uninhabited, like holiday homes for the rich. By the water's edge, Tayo watched the boats and the fishermen. It was where ordinary people, even the poor, mingled with tourists and the neighborhood locals. Tayo always paused to watch the fishermen. Some would be squatting and fixing bait to their lines. Others would be standing about casting their rods, while others sat, waiting patiently for a bite. Sometimes they caught big fish, but mostly just little ones. Tayo chatted to the fishermen and surprised them with his smattering of Cantonese that he still remembered from a past visit to Shanghai. He practiced the language with them, gradually adding a few more words to his lexicon. Back in Kemi's apartment, Tayo began to cook. He prepared rice and a rudimentary tomato and onion stew. He discovered, to his surprise, and with Laurent's encouragement, that he was not a bad cook. Time went by more quickly now that he was due to return to his home country. Obasanjo was back in power, and Tayo looked forward to participating in a new Nigeria. He was in touch again with Vanessa, and had even taken the time to track down other old friends. Bolaji had been appointed Professor of International Law at Nottingham. Francis had acquired an American accent and citizenship, and was working for the State Department in Washington, D.C., and cousin Tunde was the pastor of the fastest-growing Nigerian church in London. Yusuf was still in Jos, and had started, of all things, several Christian television stations. Tayo supposed that Yusuf had converted to Christianity, but it might simply have been one more opportunistic Yusufian move. When Tayo went on his walks, he held imaginary conversations with these friends. He usually walked for an hour, or longer if his musings needed more time, as was always the case when he thought of Vanessa. There were many tourists that walked the path behind the fishermen, young, old, black, and white. America was a melting pot of people from all over the world, and yet Tayo had often sensed some unease around this diversity in his classroom. The question of race was something he discussed on many occasions with Kwame. "Why do you think I left this country to go to Nigeria in the first place?" Kwame had laughed when Tayo first broached the topic. "Look, Tayo, if you live in America long enough, you'll see that there is no way of avoiding race. Race is a part of the fabric of this nation. You're either black or you're white, and this affects every aspect of your life. That's why so many of us left in the 70s. But it strikes me that it's not as simple as black and white," Tayo mused. "I see race playing out in my classroom between blacks, whites, and Latinos, and some of the worst tension I find is between Africans and African Americans." Kwame laughed. "That's because most West African brothers and sisters don't understand or appreciate our history." "And the same could be said for African Americans," Tayo added. "Yes, you're right, of course," Kwame nodded. "The misunderstanding is mutual and easily exploited by whites. How many times have you and your daughter been told by white people how wonderful you are and how different you are to African Americans? I think you should discuss this in your class. See what the students have to say. Hold a debate." So Tayo did. He chose a topic that he hoped would make his students think more carefully about Africa's history, as well as America's history. In the style of debate that he'd grown to love at Oxford, he chose a quotation and asked his students to use it as the basis for their arguments. The quote, which he considered suitably provocative and sure to elicit some good debate, came from Trevor Roper. "Perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none or very little. There is only the history of Europe in Africa. The rest is largely darkness, like the history of pre-Columbian America, and darkness is not a subject for history." As expected, the statement provoked reaction from the students, but not quite in the way Tayo had expected. Firstly, none of his white students wanted to take a position in favor of the motion, so that was the first hurdle. Tayo found himself having to make it clear to his students that arguing a position was not the same as agreeing with it, but this was easier said than done. White students for the motion kept apologizing, and the one African student in the class became offended when an African American spoke convincingly in favor of the motion. At one point there was almost a fistfight. Tayo would not repeat the exercise. A ship's foghorn broke Tayo's thoughts as he made his way back to Kemi's apartment. It cried its long, lonesome call, warning others of poor visibility in the bay, and reminding Tayo of the Oriole and crossing the Irish Sea. A bird hopped close to where Tayo walked. It only had one leg. Were there many one-legged pigeons by San Francisco's bay, or did he just keep seeing the same one over and over again? It was injured, but still able to fly. Like me, Tayo thought, injured yet pulling things together, and, metaphorically if not literally, flying again. Back at the apartment, Tayo found a Federal Express package waiting by the door. He put it to one side, thinking it was for Kemi, but when she returned home she gave it to him. "From the Nigerian embassy," Tayo noted, cautiously turning the package this way and that. He thought of Delegiwa, and had the package been any heavier, he wouldn't have opened it. Still, As a precaution, he went to a different room from his daughter and opened it at arm's length. A diplomatic pouch fell out onto the floor. Tayo picked it up and found a letter inside. "A letter from the president," he murmured, reading the note. Kemi had now joined him. "It says you've been awarded an honorary degree from Oxford," Kemi read over his shoulder. "Well, this can't be true, can it?" Tayo said. "I've heard nothing from Oxford." "Probably because they sent the letter to Nigeria," Kemi offered. "Daddy, this is fantastic. Look, it's congratulating you on a lifetime achievement." "I can hardly believe it. Do you think this is really true? They give these sorts of things to famous people with Nobel laureates or OBEs and MBEs, not to ordinary people like me." "Well, now it's you, Daddy. We'll call Oxford tonight. First thing, UK time." Well, Tayo smiled in spite of himself. If this really was true, then there was someone he would have to call first. "I must call Vanessa," he said, thinking aloud before he had time to check himself. Kemi smiled, and Tayo tried to recall how much he told her about Vanessa. With all the excitement, he couldn't remember. Perhaps it didn't matter. Chapter 36. Tayo received an honorary degree along with 5 other honorees. 2 were awarded doctorates of civil law, 1 a doctorate of music, another a doctorate in science, and 2, Tayo being 1, the honorary doctorate of letters. Insignia took place in the Sheldonian, a long and rambling ceremony conducted in Latin for 6 distinguished persons. But in Vanessa's mind, this was a celebration mainly for Tayo. At last he was receiving the recognition he deserved. After the ceremony, she stood and watched him with pride as he mingled with the guests. She'd met Tayo briefly, just before the ceremony began, when they'd hugged but hardly spoken, too many people and not enough time. Perhaps that was the way it should be, with no time for sentimentalism. But no, that was not the way it should be. They needed more time together. She needed more time with him. "Do you know all these people?" Suleiman whispered. "No," Vanessa shook her head, even though she knew many of them. "Come and join us," a young woman called as she ran towards them. "You must be my father's friend, Vanessa." "Yes," Vanessa smiled, "and you must be Kemi." "I am." Kemi gripped Vanessa's hand tightly before turning to greet Suleiman. Suleiman took Kemi's hand, and Vanessa breathed a sigh of relief. Suleiman could be funny about things like this sometimes. "Come," Kemi urged. "Let me introduce you to everyone." Again, Vanessa hugged Tayo and congratulated him. "When will I see you?" Tayo asked, releasing Vanessa from the hug but not letting go of her hand. "I'll see you soon." Vanessa squeezed his fingers, which were being taken by others as more well-wishers surrounded them, jostling and making it hard to stay standing together. Vanessa moved away and followed Kemi to be introduced to Bisi and Bolaji and reintroduced to Uncle Kayode. Vanessa did not recognize Uncle Kayode at first, and despite his enthusiastic greeting, he seemed unable to remember her either, which saddened her until she realized that he'd had too much to drink, and others were busy trying to find a place for him to sit down. Then Kemi introduced Vanessa to Miriam, and Vanessa was stunned by how youthful Miriam looked. She'd always imagined Tayo's wife as being someone of her age, and perhaps she was, but she looked younger. She was friendly, too, and instead of feeling jealous, Vanessa felt strangely sorry for Miriam for all that she imagined she had gone through. They spoke for a while about what each other did, and then about their children, who stood not far away, engaged in a conversation of their own. "So what's America like then?" Suleiman asked Kemi. "Great. The weather's good, the music's good, it's totally happening, you should come. But I hear they don't care much for Muslims over there." "But it's not like that in the Bay Area. You can be any religion you want in San Francisco, it doesn't matter. You should come. Come and stay with me." "Seriously?" "Of course." Vanessa smiled, wishing she could eavesdrop a little more, but Bolaji, whom she only vaguely remembered, was keen to talk as they started walking towards Balliol, where a reception was being held in Tayo's honour. Miriam announced that she was leaving early, and Vanessa felt she must do the same. "Oh, but you can't go," Tayo said, looking at Vanessa. "No, you can't," Kemi insisted. "Dad's been dying to see you." Vanessa's heart leapt as she heard these words, touched by Kemi's kindness, but still she insisted on going back. She had to get back to London to look after Edward, she explained. "Don't worry about Dad," Suleiman interrupted. "I'm going back. Dad'll be fine." And so Vanessa stayed on at the reception with Tayo and his friends. She wished that there had been time for just the 2 of them. Perhaps they would meet up in London before Tayo returned to America. And then, just as she was lost in her own thoughts, Tayo walked towards her and took her arm. "Come," he said, leading her away from the crowd. "If we don't escape now, we never will." "So now it's Professor Ajayi, Doctor in Litteris," she said, smiling, as they walked together past Christ Church towards the river. "Ego actoritat mea et totius universitatis admitto te ad gradum doctoris in litteris honoris causa," he replied. "So you haven't forgotten your Latin?" "Oh, yes, I have," he laughed. "Truthfully, that's the only line I can remember, and don't ask me for a translation." She listened to the familiar tenor of his voice and thought that it hardly mattered what he said. Of course, they would both make conversation, because that was what one did, but just to be with him and alone with him, this was what she wanted. She was due back in London before dark, and Tayo, she knew, could not abandon his own reception for long, but for a short while they were on their own together. She watched him looking across Christchurch meadows, where cows basked lazily in the late afternoon sun. Just before they ducked out of the reception, Tayo had received a small parcel from the porter's lodge, which he now carried in one hand. He'd stopped for a moment, turning back to gaze at the college, and she thought he looked more casual and relaxed than the last time they had met. He'd changed out of subfusk and was now wearing pale khaki trousers and a light blue shirt. After all these years, he was still handsome, unnervingly so. She wore the blue cotton dress that Suleiman had chosen, a pair of cream suede shoes, a last-minute extravagance, and a straw hat. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. "Sorry?" "You seem deep in thought. What are you thinking?" she said, louder this time so he could hear. "It's the history of this place, Vanessa. There's so much history here. Did I mention that I'm staying at the Master's Lodge?" She nodded. "In the Master's Lodge, there's a guest book that starts in 1909. In America, something like that would be treated as ancient, wouldn't it? But here it's just an ordinary guest book, and one that I'm supposed to sign alongside all these very famous people. There are prime ministers, world leaders, and all sorts. I saw the names of Harold Wilson, Isaiah Berlin, Gandhi, and even Seretse and Ruth Kama." "The Kamas. Now that's interesting," Vanessa remarked, remembering their story. "Sorry? I was just saying how interesting, the Kamas, Wilson, Gandhi, and now you." He laughed, and then they walked for some moments in silence, each with their own thoughts. She wanted to ask him more about Kemi and about his plans for the future. They had not yet spoken about his accident or the months of his depression in San Francisco, which was something Kemi had mentioned to Vanessa in confidence. She wanted to tell him about Father's book and her plans to return to Nigeria. "Oxford really hasn't changed, has it?" Tayo pointed to the meadows. "Look at Christchurch and all of this. If I closed my eyes, it could still be 1964. The sounds are the same, the bells, the coaches shouting to their rowers on the river, light aircraft in the sky, and the sounds of trains in the distance. There's even the same smell of grass and river." He paused with his eyes still shut. "And then, when I look again, here you are. It's like a beautiful dream come true." "Well, I've certainly changed in the space of 30 or so years." "Ah, but you're still the gracious, generous soul that I knew, and the beautiful woman I fell in love with," he said, walking more slowly. She smiled. They'd reached the river and walked along the path that ran in front of the college boathouses. "Do you remember summer 8s?" she asked, knowing what he would say next. "You mean when you and Gita got completely drunk and wanted to get into the boat with the rowers from St. John's? Are you sure it wasn't the Balliol rowers?" she laughed. "Shall we?" Tayo pointed to a bench by the river bank. "But shouldn't you be getting back?" "Oh, I'm sure they won't miss me. This is where I want to be. And I must also thank you, Vanessa, because I know you had a hand in my receiving this award." "Not at all," she said, even though it was true that she'd written something in support of his nomination. But her voice alone would not have been enough to have him selected. She sat down, pleased for the rest from her new shoes. "Kemi's a delightful young woman, Tayo. I wish that Suleiman had been able to stay a little longer." "So that we could match-make our children?" Tayo smiled. "Oh, Tayo, it sounds like Kemi is already spoken for." "Not until I say so," he laughed. "And how is Suleiman?" "He's well, very well," she smiled, remembering the way her son had teased her as she struggled that morning over what to wear. She'd gone into his room to model her clothes, and at first he said nothing, too busy listening to his music. "Chill, Mum, chill," he said, when finally he had noticed her. "You look terrific. You'll look beautiful for him." "So you haven't told me much about your stay in America," she remarked. "What is this book you're thinking of writing?" She listened as he told her about his writings on American racial politics. His perspective as an African in America sounded interesting, but, as hard as she listened, it was only him she thought about as he talked, who he'd been and who he still was. "Perhaps you should have written about your time in England as a student and the racism here, and I suppose my father and—" She let the words trail off. "It wasn't just your father, Nessa. I was proud, too proud in those days, and so stupid too." He paused. "Vanessa." "Tayo," she said, speaking before he had time to say any more. And then, not wanting to dwell on regrets, she asked him to tell her more about San Francisco. "What's the other project you mentioned? And what about retirement?" He looked at her, but didn't say anything. Perhaps, like her, he was sifting through thoughts, trying to determine what to say and when, what was worth saying. "So I take it you won't be retiring when you return to Nigeria," she added. "I ought to retire," he said, "because the age of retirement in Nigerian universities is 60. But I'll continue to teach, if not officially, then unofficially." "Oh, but surely now you have this honorary degree, they'll dispense with the official rules and make you Vice-Chancellor for life." "I hope not," he said, turning to face her. "I just want to go back quietly. I don't want to be involved in university politics anymore. I've done my time. I'm too old now." He placed one hand along the back of the bench and the other in the space between them. "Will you come and visit me one day?" "I will, Tayo, and in fact—" "And of course you must bring Edward," he added, before she could finish. She smiled. Edward found it hard to travel these days. Even the short journey from London to Oxford, which he'd wanted to make today, proved at the last minute to be too much for him. "I know," Tayo nodded. "You've told me that he's growing frail, but I pray that he regains his strength. I shall pray for a miracle." "Thank you," she replied. "Does this mean you believe in prayer now?" "In my own way," he smiled. She nodded and gazed at the river, watching the rowers. "And how I prayed that you would return, that we would find a way to make things work," she thought. She looked back at Tayo and found him watching her. Feeling shy, she turned away. "Look at that," she said, spotting a squirrel close to their feet. Its tail was arched and nose lifted, sniffing the air. "Do you remember what we used to call them?" The squirrel scuttled a few feet away, raising now on his hind legs with paws up, waiting. "I remember you called them rats with bushy tails." Yes, Tayo laughed. They were good times together, weren't they? He removed his hand from the back of the bench and rested it with the other on his lap. Yes, and I miss those days, he said softly, filling in for her silence. Sometimes I wish I could just go back in time and relive them. I would make different choices now. And what would you change? Vanessa asked. I would have married you. Oh, Tayo. No, it's true. As an old man, I realize what I've missed. He sighed and gave her knee a friendly pat. She took his hand and squeezed it as if there was nothing more to say, yet every nerve in her body ached to tell him she had felt the same for so long. I have some things for you, he said, picking up his parcel and handing it to her. Inside the parcel was a letter and a book. She began to read the letter. I'm writing to inform you that I have serious intentions with Vanessa. I wrote it a long time ago, Tayo said, interrupting her reading. It's a letter to my uncle, and, well, I just wanted you to know that I was serious and that I had wanted to marry you. Tears came to her eyes as she read more. And this? She asked. My goodness, how did you get this? She flipped quickly through the pages of her old diary and saw the places where she had scribbled Olua Kayode, the name she had dreamed of giving their child. My God, she mumbled. And then, as she struggled to hold back more tears, a middle-aged couple she recognized from the ceremony approached them and asked if they would take a photograph for them. Certainly, Tayo offered, standing to take the camera from the strangers who now stood in front of them. The man held his lady by the waist, sucked in his stomach, and smiled as his wife leant her braided head against his chest. Vanessa watched them as they posed, and, as she watched, she felt a wave of déjà vu. Her mind raced back across time to find the answer. Was it a memory of the way her photographer friend, Seydou Keita, asked her subjects to pose? Or was it Salamatu in 1970, with her hair braided like this woman's? Or perhaps she was seeing an image of her parents before she was born, in a time that she had only imagined. Or sticks and sandals, she thought. Mum and Danjuma, Tayo and Vanessa. Now let's get one of you two, the man offered. Okay, Tayo agreed, cheerfully handing him his pocket camera. He sat down and moved closer to Vanessa until their hips touched, and she prayed for the tears to stay put. Come on, my brother, the man urged, lowering the camera. Let's see a little more loving. Vanessa clenched her jaw in an even greater effort to hold back her tears and smile for the photo. Tayo laughed and slid his arm around her shoulders. Instinctively, she turned her head to his, and without thinking, tired of thinking, she kissed him gently on the lips. And then it was fervently, not caring what the other couple thought or said, as the tears ran down her cheeks. Night had fallen, and 3 students that had passed them on their way out to the river now passed them again, still sitting on the bench, hand in hand, with her head on his shoulder, staring across the river. They must be mad, said one. It's freezing. Probably tourists, whispered another. And then the ringing of Christ Church's bells drowned their voices out. The cows in the meadows paid no attention to these hourly chimes. The moon, however, took notice of the bells and rose from behind its clouds to light up the sky and send silver ripples across the Isis.